14. It was huge. The 10th floor of the Labyrinth Tower was almost entirely taken up by the boss chamber, so that wasn't a surprise in and of itself, but its impression upon seeing the 6th floor boss room for the first time in 4.5 months was that it was just huge. The walls, floor, and ceiling were bluish gray color, and the weak lighting made the corners of the room look black. There was a huge star drawn on the ceiling high overhead, a reminder that the tower and this room on top of it was actually a pentagonal shape. Viewing from the desert below, the width of the tower was about half of its height. If it was 100 meters tall, then the diagonal would be about 50 meters on each side. Hey Asuna, what's the ratio of the side of a pentagon to a diagonal again? I murmured. The fencer shot me a look that said, "Why now?" "It's 1 plus 1, the root of 5 over 2. That's 1.618. 1.618, I repeated. So if the diagonal was 50 meters, a side would be about 30 meters? Closer to 31, to be precise, but it probably doesn't matter that much. I see. The only reason we could chat about unimportant topics like this in the boss chamber was because we were waiting for the ALS and the DKB to get set up in position. It seemed like we still had another 30 seconds to go. Asuna turned to me this time and said, 1 plus 1, the root, or 5 over 2 is called the golden ratio. Golden? It's found in the length to width ratio of the Parthenon, or in the upper and lower halves of the Venus de Milo. Even human faces, the width and nose are about considered well balanced if their ratio is 1:1:6:1:8, apparently. Oh, I murmured, staring at Asuna's face in an attempt to see if it was true. She promptly jabbed at me in the side, and Argo had to warn us. "Hey, we're in the boss chamber!" Mia giggled. At last, Cabal shouted from the other side of the room. "Placements are complete. We're ready to go." "Got it," I shouted, glancing behind me. The double doors, which jutted inward about 10 meters from one of the sides of the Pentagon, were still wide open. I'd prayed silently that they would stay that way and looked over to Theano, who stood next to her daughter. "Well, go ahead, Theano." "I will," she said, and the warrior focused on the golden cube in her hands. I saw some kind of expression ripple across her beautiful features, like waves on a pond, then vanish. "Then let's begin. Don't go too forward, Mia," she warned her daughter, beginning to walk towards the center of the chamber. Where she was headed sat a very strange object. Its shape was quite simple. It was a cube about a half meter to a side. It was as black and unreflective as if it was carved right out of charcoal. Though the detail were hard to make out in the dim light, there was a square hole about 20 centimeters across on the side facing us. It was obvious at a glance that the golden cube would fit inside it perfectly. "Once the cube goes in, it'll be so flush we won't be able to pull it back out," I noted idly. On my right, Argo said, "For my inspection earlier, there's a little hole on the opposite side of the cube." "Oh, so you could shove a stick inside and push it back out." "A sticker," Argo started to say, then clammed up. Theano had crouched and stuck the cube into the hollow. The pitch-black hole accepted the cube as though it was oiled up. There was no scratching whatsoever. The moment the black and gold surface became one, the dark bluish floor rumbled briefly. Suddenly, the black cube began to shine with golden light. Theano quickly retreated, and the raid members readied themselves at a safe distance. Many swords and spears reflected in the shining light as the cube silently left the floor and floated into the air. It came to a stop about 3 meters off the ground. then began to rotate sideways. It started slow, but picked up noticeable speed, becoming one with the gloom. One of the line of the golden cubes itself remained visible, creating a ring of light in the air. The air shook again. A number of golden cubes appeared practically out of thin air and began to spin as well. But in fact, though I could count them directly, I knew exactly how many cubes there were. 26. Golden cubes surrounded the rapidly spinning black cube and began to affix themselves to it. The rotation gradually slowed and came to a stop, revealing one golden block that was 3 times its previous size. Now nearly 2 meters to a side, the 26 cubes that had lined themselves up 3 by 3 to connect together, but they were not fused. There was a tiny bit of space left between them. In other words, they formed a giant Rubik's Cube. It's just like in the beta. If you hit the edges with your weapon, they'll rotate to... I stopped short, noticing something different. In the beta, the sides were red, blue, green, yellow, white, and black. Here, all the sides were the same gold color. Now, there was no way to line them up. Or they were already lined up, I suppose. With the roar of a combustion engine, the 26 smaller cubes began to rotate in all directions at random. When they stopped, there was a bright pattern on the face of each of the 9 square sides of the cube, of 44 squares in total. No, that wasn't a pattern. It was more familiar than that. Something written. Numbers? Asuna gasped, right as the single bar of HP gauge appeared in the air over the giant Rubik's Cube. Below the bar, the boss's official name, shining in bright English letters, the Irrational Cube. As I expected, the double doors boomed shut at that moment. "Here it comes," shouted a voice, most likely Lynn's. In reaction to that call, 3 of the boss's 8 corners emitted a pale gray lines that stabbed at the raid party. I summoned all the lung power I had bellowed. "Evade!" Immediately, red lasers shot forth, tracing the gray lines. They emitted terrifying, swooping, sizzling sounds as small explosions erupted at 3 places in the chamber. Fortunately, no one took a direct hit, but I did see a few of the many HP bars in my vision dip a little due to local heat damage. The color and the name were different from the beta. It had been the irritating cube, but this attack, at the very least, was very familiar. Aiming lines that were hard to pick up came first, following a second later by lasers. It would take a huge chunk of HP from any light armored players it stuck. But as long as you were calm and observant, it wasn't hard to dodge them. Assuming you didn't trip or get frozen, of course. Hoping to get a hint from the boss's English name, I turned to whisper my partner and said rapidly, "What does the word irrational mean, Asuna? In the beta, it was irritating, which I looked up later." "It's kind of like illogical or incoherent." "Illogical," I repeated. "No kidding. Even a child could line up the colors, but these numbers... Wait, maybe the numbers were the same thing? Are you saying that we have to fill each side with the same number?" I said, hoping that I'd found the solution, but Argo shattered that hope just as quickly as it arrived. "But the numbers that go up to 9! She was right. The glowing Arabic numerals were arranged randomly from 1 to 9, meaning that it would be impossible to match them up to the 6 separate sides like a classical Rubik's Cube. I even considered the brain teaser-like option of flipping the 9 over to be a 6, but that wouldn't be enough. The 6 and 9 had distinctly separate designs anyway. As though an NPC was what I really needed for a hint. Theano came back our way. "Theano, what do we do with the I started to ask, but the woman just shook her head, looking pensive. "I don't know either. The legend around the mansion said only to destroy the cube. It must be returned to the body of the tower's guardian." Oh, okay. In the meantime, the boss kept firing its lasers from the center of the room. The raid members weaved and jumped out of the way and struck the floating object with their weapons. Each blow caused the rows of the columns of the cubes to rotate 90 degrees, but there was no damage to its HP at all. It seemed the numbered cube was invincible, but we needed to solve its puzzle to pull the blocks off. But there was nothing we could do without figuring out what kind of puzzle it was. The unease and frustration that filled the chamber finally sparked, and an orange flash went off near the boss. Someone had used a sword skill on it. "Don't!" I shouted on instinct, but it was too late, of course. A 2-part spear strike sent up bright sparks from the face of the irrational cube, but not a single of each pixel did damage, and the boss sent out an aiming line as if on cue. "Dodge!" Kabao bellowed. A gang of players near the line all leaped at once, except for the spearman, who was still frozen from the skill. A red laser seared him dead on. "Ah!" shrieked the player, right as I heard a dull explosion. It looked like Chicken Speck from ALS. He blasted off his feet and collapsed on the ground. One of the HP bars from Team C went down into the yellow zone, over halfway to 0. His friends helped move him over to the wall, but it would take some time for him to heal up. "Maybe we should retreat for now, Kirito," Asuna said, sounding tense. I bobbed my head somewhat awkwardly. It was clearly the right option. The boss was invincible, and we didn't know how to undo it. Letting the battle drag on in this state was inevitably going to lead to some disastrous results. But I spun around and caught the side of the doors, which were shut tight. Asuna gasped. She hadn't realized they'd closed. "We don't know for sure they won't open again," I said, out of hope, if nothing else, and raced for them, crossing the 10 meters in the blink of an eye, and practically slamming my free hand against the door. The thick bronze metal rattled a tiny bit, but did not bulge. It was locked. Suddenly, a series of pale lights flashed across my vision, and I turned away. I held my breath, thinking it was an attack from the boss, but I felt nothing. I looked back and gasped again. Numbers. There was a grid of light glowing on the surface of the door in Arabic numerals and boxes. They were in the same font as the ones used in the boss's cube body, but they were more blank squares than squares with numbers inside. I took a step back and with a better look, right as Asuna arrived behind me. Together, we shouted, "A Sudoku puzzle!" There was no doubt about it, the exact same kind of puzzles as in the teleport square in Statuen, but filling the entire width of the massive door. "So if we solve this, the doors will open?" said Argo over our shoulders. I think so," I said uncertainly. "But there's just no way." It wasn't my style to give up before even trying something, but there was no other option this time. This puzzle had 27 rows and columns of Sudoku puzzles, each one in the 9x9 format, for a total of 727. That would be one more than in the square in Statuen. But the layout was identical. In my mind, I replayed something Asuna had said 4 days earlier. "At a glance, these look like maximum difficulty, so even an expert would take a good 20 minutes to solve one. Multiplying that by 728 would be 14,560 minutes. Divided by 60 makes 242 hours and 40 minutes. 242 hours. A little over 10 whole days. That would be an entire day if split between 10 people. And trying to do them while avoiding the boss's attacks the entire time? Impossible. I'm guessing that even the number layout are exactly the same in Statuen Square, Asuna whispered, her voice hoarse. We should have solved the puzzles in Statuen, then come up to this room by the end of the day. That was the minimum requirement for fighting this boss. But how would we know that? I tried to say. But I remembered looking up at these doors from the other side and seeing the grid pattern on the relief. It was a 9x9 grid. If I had just made the connection to Sudoku, I could have remembered about the teleport square in Statuen. Damn! I was about to slam my clenched fist against the cold, glowing puzzle when I heard a voice behind me. Do we just need to solve these puzzles, Kirito? My hand paused midair. I turned around and saw Mia, her gas mask off. staring at me with big eyes. You can solve this? Yep, she chirped. Much more appropriate for her age now that her mother was around again. She trotted up to the door and reached for the puzzle in the bottom right corner. Her finger traced the empty slots with dizzying speed until she selected one of the glowing space to tap. When a window appeared with all the digits to choose from. She picked a 7. The other spaces disappeared, replacing a single large 7. It took her a total of 10 seconds. Whoa, what? How did you do that so fast? I gaped. Mia spun to face me and beamed. Well, ever since I was a little girl, I solved these puzzles in the town square with my mother every day. That explanation didn't cover the speed she exhibited. But then I remembered something. Kismel had no major connection to puzzles, but she had solved the 15 puzzle secret key in dungeon in a matter of seconds. If an AI could solve an NP high problem that fast, these Sudoku puzzles must be no harder than simple arithmetic equations to them. I'll help you too, of course, said Fiano, who stepped up next to Mia. I looked from their faces to the puzzle behind me at the back. At 10 seconds per puzzle, it would take 7,290 seconds to solve 729 of them. That would be a bit over 120 minutes. With the two of them, that would be 60 minutes, an hour. Maybe there was a chance. Please, Theano and Mia, do your best. They nodded, set up the right and left corners, and began solving, their fingers flying. I grabbed the shoulder of my still stunned partner and said, Asuna, we got to grab that boss's attention. Our assignment is to dodge it for the next hour somehow. Oh, okay, if you say so. What should I do? Asked Argo. When Mia needs to solve the problem higher on the door, lift her up, I shouted, and started to run with Asuna towards the center of the chamber, but I hit the brakes just as suddenly. What's the big idea? Hey, listen, I said. If you select the right number from a pull-down menu, can't we just go and select every number from the starting one? The fencer gave me the most annoyed look in our entire personal history together, and shoved her face so close to mine, our nose nearly touched. If they set up the puzzle that way, it's obviously going to fail as soon as we make the mistake. Oh, right. Chastised, I allowed us to run back to the boss for real this time. The hour that passed after this point was the longest and hardest hour of all that many I'd spent in Aincrad so far. The boss battles of the second and fifth floor had been tough, but I just focused on fighting the enemy that didn't process the passage of time. Those were fights to win and move on. This was different. We were evading attacks for an entire hour just to escape the room. Watch for the aiming beams of the 8 corners of the irrational cube, then dodge. That was all involved, but the finders were hard to see. And their timing and location were nastily designed. Often you would strike the place you dodged at a time delay. It tried to gather multiple players in one place to collide it with one another. Sometimes it incessantly went after a single individual. Whatever the thought process it followed, it didn't seem like a simple algorithm. When Asa and I joined the frontline battle, we explained the situation to the ALS and the DKB. Of course, it had been a undeniable effect on the overall morale. Until that point, everyone had assumed that if the numbers were rotated enough, however it was supposed to work, they would eventually be able to inflict damage. But the intended numbers were a mystery to anyone who were disappointed to learn that they needed to dodge for an entire hour just to escape. And if your level of concentration dipped, so did your mobility, making the danger rise. The next thing I knew, over 10 of the 36 other raid members were back along the wall after taking direct laser blasts. The Irrational Cube hadn't moved far from the center of the room because that was where the majority of the players were. The more people who retreated to the walls, the sooner the boss would start to target them too. And the wider its movement range would be more likely to stray towards the entrance of the door where it could attack Mia and Theano in the act of desperately solving of all the Sudoku puzzles. Was the only one thing we had to avoid. Asa and I shared thoughts with a single instant eye contact, and I gave the boss a 3-part sharp nail sword skill. The HP bar didn't bulge, of course, but the hate buildup from the cube caused all 3 targeting lines to aim for me. By that time, however, Asa had already lifted me into her arms and raced off with me while the skill delay was active. There was an explosion behind us, but we suffered no damage, just a little prickle of heat on the back. Next, Asuna gave the boss a 3-part triangular skill, and it was my turn to move her. That should be enough to keep the enemy focused on us too. Naturally, the algorithm wasn't so simple that it would solely focus on players with the highest hate quotient, and it occasionally strayed to go after others. But if we could draw half the lasers with our high agility, that would give other 6 parties major breathing room to left. "Kirito, ahead to the left!" I followed Asuna's direction to avoid aiming beam I couldn't see and dashed in that direction. When applicable, I returned the favor. After this was repeated enough times, something strange began to happen. Every once in a while, before I even heard Asuna's voice, I felt like I knew which way to go. It happened to her too. More than once I called out, "Right!" after Asuna was already jumping that way. It was as though our minds were connected on some other channel beyond just voice and ears. It was a painful fight, knowing that it would not end in triumph, but I did feel an undeniable kind of elation as I dodged and wove around the target lines. When I had a moment to check my window for the first time in a few instants, the boss traveled away from me. The minutes crawled agonizingly slow. But finally, a few minutes after 10 in the evening, "It's the last one, Kirito!" came Mia's young but firm voice from the back of the chamber. I leapt backward on instinct and glanced at the door. Nearly all the Sudoku puzzles on their surface had the correct numbers on them, leaving only the central puzzle, which the Anno was in the process of solving now. She hit the key box and selected a number from the pull-down menu, and promptly enlarged and began to glow. As expected over the course of the hour, they solved the 729 puzzles. A rumble ran through the doors, and the rest of the chamber as well. A line of light appeared through the center of the closed doors, and there was a loud clicking sound of a lock unlatching. Letting us escape the route was opened at last. "Let's retreat into the hallway. Members undergoing healing, get outside first," commanded Lind, swinging his scimitar. A dozen plus players drinking potions along the wall stood up and began to run towards the door. Even the irrational cube, which had been wildly firing its lasers just a second ago, stopped in seeming recognition of the open door. At the very least, we wouldn't have to worry about the entire frontline group weighing out. It sucked that we couldn't knock even a single pixel off the boss's HP bar, but that was because we were missing a crucial piece of information. If we went back and cleared out all the quests in Statuen or Murutsuki, we would find out whatever we were meant to line up the boss's numbers. "Kirito?" Asuna whispered, grabbing my elbow. I saw that she was looking at the doors, which were still closed. She was sensing something, but she couldn't tell what it was, her body language said. I stared at the huge double doors 20 meters away, feeling the time gradually lengthen. 729 puzzles had turned into 729 numbers that glowed silently at us. 729, which was 27 squared, 27 rows and 27 columns, a 3x3 grid and a 9x9 number blocks. I craned my neck, looking back at the floating irrational cube in the center of the room. Then the door again. It sucked in as much air as my lungs and handle and screamed, "Stop!" The players just a few meters from the door stopped reaching for it as it turned direction of my voice. The DKB Shivada was closest to me. He looked aghast. "What's wrong? Aren't we getting out of here?" "Wait, I think those numbers..." I shot Asuna a look and started running until I had to thrust myself in front of the door with my hands out to signal everyone to keep back. Then I waited. If my hunch was correct, this puzzle wasn't meant to create an escape route. Clearing it would open the door, but it was probably a trick. If we just waited, I was certain. The raid party's confusion, irritation, and haste grew thicker and darker by the second. 5, 6, 7. When nearly 30 seconds had passed, Theano finished the last puzzle. It finally happened. The 729 numbers suddenly flashed. Over the half numbers vanished, as though burned away by the light. In various blank spots of the grid, there were faintly glowing boxes. Lastly, 4 of the grid lines thickened, cutting the entire pattern to a 9x9 chunk. Ah! Asuna gasped behind me. To my sides, Mia and Anno were equally shocked. It wasn't a random, meaningless string of numbers, arranged in 27 in columns. It was a set of 9 Sudoku puzzles. A tremendous sound, somewhere between a machine and the roar of a living creature, shook the room. I spun around and saw the irrational cube was moving again. And not just that. 3 of its 4 vertical faces were now growing long arms made of dozens of small cubes. The last face began to glow brightly. "It's coming!" bellowed Cabal from the back, readying his sword. Lind issued a similar order to his followers. "Retreat cancelled. Keep healing if you're damaged. Come back and remake formation if you're fine." They too had sensed that the boss's attacks were going to intensify, but that meant there was now a chance to actually beat it. "Mia, Theano, handle these puzzles too," I shouted. They sprang into action. As the doors began to slide their palms over their much larger puzzles, 10 seconds later, they pressed the key boxes in unison and selected their answers. Those numbers grew larger and shone brighter. Mother and daughter completed their puzzles at the exact same speed, Theano taking the higher puzzles and Mia going for the low ones, 4, 6, 8 as they completed, leaving just one more to go. There were fierce blasts, crashing, and sounds from behind them, but they did their best to tune it out and focus on the moment. Theano put her hand in the center of the puzzle and selected 5 from the menu. The puzzles expanded to fill the place. The moment all the puzzles were finished, the door shone with even more light than a previous time. I took several steps from the back and memorized the order of the 9 mammoth numbers on the door. "Thank you. We'll handle the rest," I told them, turning back. I raced towards the raid party and shouted as loud as my throat can handle. "From top left across, it's 8, 3, 4, 1, 5, 9, 6, 7, 2. There was a moment of silence. A dull roar rose across all around. With the numbers we needed to reveal, the lower morale began to rise again. In this situation, the teamwork and coordination of the 2 major guilds were at their best. Even without members in the process of healing, they got into formation that quickly surrounded the boss. And yet, lining the numbers instead of the colors was much harder than one might imagine. The numbers only had to be arranged in the one face that was lit up, but each row moved 3 numbers together. You had to be constantly aware of what numbers were on each face and read several moves ahead of the present arrangement. 3 minutes after the combat resumed, my figures turned out to be prescient. The rearranging of numbers was not moving quickly. They got the first 4 pretty smoothly, but then once moving caused others to go out of alignment, and irritation began creeping into Lind and Cabal's voices. If we whacked in a hunch, we'd eventually get it, but the boss's long arms were not to be taken lightly. On the top of the lasers, we now had to watch out for slams and swipes from the arms, which steadily ground down the HP of combat members. I wasn't sure whether to leap into the front row, or if that would only ruin the teamwork the 6 parties were using. "Okay, I've got it," Asuna said abruptly. She shot me a glance. "Kirito, I'm gonna focus on giving orders. Can you handle the boss?" Yeah, of course." We gave each other a nod and moved simultaneously. And Asuna leapt forward to the front line and brandished her rapier. "Knock the lower block to the right." "Got it!" Hafner replied from the DKB. He hoisted his greatsword, circled around the right side of the boss, and swiped sideways. Once again, it did no damage, but the lower block did loudly rotate to the right, as Asuna instructed. "Now knock the left blocks down." "Roger that," replied ALS Okutan, whose halberd shone. The left column of the blocks rotated downward. At this, the irrational cube must have sensed a difference. Because it let out a discordant metal shriek, it swung two appendages made of cubes, hurtling them down at Asuna. I promptly leapt forward and activated the sword skill Vertical Arc, which was a two-strike combo of downward and upward slices, and it knocked the two arms away. Behind me, Asuna did not move a single step. Once she focused solely on numbers, Asuna's orders were frighteningly precise. With each block rotating, we could sense it growing closer to completion. But just as the boss could sense it too, its vicious repeatedly went after Asuna, who was not physically attacking it. I could knock the arms away with sword skills, but the lasers were trickier. Each time the aiming beams swept toward her, I picked her up and jumped out of the way, but that even got harder when it did a delayed combination of lasers and then physical attacks. The raid members looked desperate, but if they tried attacking the boss to draw its attention, the cube formation we'd been working so hard on would be ruined. And if too many tried to surround her for protection, she wouldn't be able to see the numbers. And yet another backward leap to escape my lasers. My back struck hard against a flat surface. Somehow I'd been pushed up against a wall without realizing. Two arms went flat, swiping motions from my sides, right on cue. I could strike back on them, but not both. "I'll get this one, Kirito," said a voice. I shouted back, "Do it!" and focused on the arm coming from the left. After I knocked it away, with horizontal, I turned to my right and saw Theano thrusting the other appendage away with her sword. The strength of 100, I marveled silently, prepping for the next attack. Meanwhile, Asuna continued giving orders, which the stout warriors of the raid party faithfully carried out. Occasionally, they made the wrong input, but undoing it was as easy as reversing the last strike. The damageless assault on the boss lasted for 20-something moves, when Asuna's clear voice called out, "Next one is the last! Strike the center blocks down!" "We got it! You're on!" Lind and Cabal had no intention of letting the other have the honor of the last blow. They charged from either side and slashed the center block column with a scimitar longsword together. Don't push it, Lind and Cabal, I thought, but their aim was true. The center column rumbled and rotated, revealing the order of the 3, 5, 7. The 9 numbers on the front face of the boss shone so brightly I couldn't look at them directly. "We got it!" someone shouted, which was nearly drowned out by a deafening rumble as 26 cubes and 3 arms that made up the irrational cube's invincible armor crumbled away. Countless shards melted into thin air, revealing that pitch-black cube. After a half-meter to a side, in the middle of the side that faced us, we could see a smaller item, the cube that Theano put in there. This time, 6 new black arms extended from the black cube. They made unpleasant, high-frequency ringing sounds as they writhed towards us. "This is a real battle! Take it slow and let's figure out the patterns!" Cabal boomed. Both the ALS and the DKB alike shouted, "Yeah," in response. It was a fierce battle indeed, but without its spotless armor, the irrational cube didn't have the defense to stand up to the elite fighters of the advancement group, and more importantly, the level 32 mother swordswoman, Theano. Its single HP bar fell slowly but surely, past 50%, then 30%. Only in 7 minutes, it was down to 10%. Once everyone knew that the next good shot would end it, the irrational cube let out a horrid shriek that sounded like its dying cry and swung its 6 arms around wildly. All 8 of its corners sent out aiming beams. "It's going wild! Buckle down!" Lind commanded. Everyone went on guard. Within a moment, all of the arms had been deflected, and all the lasers dodged, and as though its batteries had run dry, the bosses of the 6th floor of Aincrad fell to the floor with a thud and ceased moving. I relaxed my shoulders, thinking it was finally over, but there was one stubborn pixel of remaining HP bar. "Wait, hey, what gives? Is it gonna self-destruct?" Cabal wailed. I wondered the same thing. The raid members nearest to the landing sprang away and buckled down against their explosion, but nothing happened. The boss's golden cube pointed in my direction. It was silent. "That reminds me, Argo said something about this," I recalled. Something about the reverse side of the cube. At that moment, someone leapt forward to the cube. Whoever it was assumed that there would be no self-destruct and wanted to seize the last attack bonus. He was dressed in silver and blue, the DKB. Lind would probably scold him later, but this would be at last be the end of a long battle. Huh? Asuna gasped at my side. I suddenly realized what she was looking at. It wasn't a weapon running player that had its hand. It was a narrow piece of metal only a few centimeters long. A throwing needle. No, a key. Time froze as the slender player crouched behind the back of the cube and stuck the key in the keyhole, where I couldn't see it. And a faint click. The golden cube slid out of the block, tumbling onto the floor. Theano let out a sharp breath and jumped forward. I raced after her. The DKB member stood up. He circled around the block and scooped the cube off the floor. As she ran, Theano silently drew her rapier. The DKB member raised the cube high in both hands and shouted, "Bind!" There was a sound of slicing air, and a ring of golden light shot forth from the cube, swallowing Theano and me as it passed us. My feet suddenly stuck to the floor, and I tipped over spectacularly. I thought I was going to tumble, but because my feet were stuck to the ground, I only leaned at an extreme angle before bouncing back upright. Theano was similarly rooted on the spot. Stunned, I looked down to see the translucent cubes growing out of the floor, engulfing my feet. On instinct, I checked my HP gauge. To the right of the list of buffs, there was a new icon that hadn't been there a second before. It was an unfamiliar debuff, a human silhouette with a square border. Why? Why would you do this? I tried to yell, but then I belatedly noticed that I had no voice. My entire body, legs, arms, even fingers, was as heavy as lead. Even in the midst of this emergency, a part of my mind was occupied with a different question. Theano's level was quite high, but not enough to obliterate the monster of the tower in one hit. She must have used the power of the golden cube to freeze or bind the Ophidians. Suddenly, I realized the boss chamber was filled with silence. I could hear no voices, nor even the scraping of metal armor. Golden light filled the vast 50-meter chamber from corner to corner. Every last raid member must have been bound. I couldn't move my right hand, so I couldn't even open my window. It was the ultimate immobilization debuff, far beyond even paralyzing poison. The mystery DKB player slowly lowered the golden cube. He wore a Saleh helmet that covered the top of his head, leaving only the mouth visible. The cursor over his head was orange, the criminal color, certainly because of the debuff he just used. His name was Buxum. I couldn't recall ever seeing that name in the raid fight before. Buxum's mouth abruptly curled into a savage grin. The moment I saw it, I knew. He was with Morche and Joe. He was one of the Black Poncho followers. At some point, he had infiltrated the DKB, waiting for this very moment to strike. If it were Morche, he'd laugh his dry laugh and spout some of the theatrical lines at this point. But Buxum just leered and said nothing instead. He transferred the large cube to one hand so he could draw his longsword. It was a modestly made, but the wet gleam on the thin blade spoke of stats that were no joking matter. The sword dangled from his hand as he strode right towards Theano. He's going to kill her, I realized instantly. Whether he was going to kill an entire raid party, starting with Theano, or just an NPC on her own, I wasn't sure. But even in the latter, I couldn't passively watch it happen. Mia was behind me. There was no way I could allow a 10-year-old girl to watch the mother she had just been reunited with be helplessly slaughtered. No way at all. Silent air escaped my throat in place of a scream. I used every bit of force I could summon. My avatar's muscles quaked and my joints creaked, but the invisible shell surrounded me did not bulge. Buxum came to a stop before Theano. He lifted his sword and aimed carefully at her, preparing to finish it all in a single blow. Move, 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 move. It was only word that came to mind, the boundaries between the start and end blurring into one pattern of sound, losing meaning. A high-pitched ringing sound rose from deep within me, spreading from my fingers to toes, and then I saw it. The bind debuff icon was blinking. A new icon began to flicker next to it, a silhouette of a person in a Zen meditative pose. It was not the meditation buff. The design was the same, but there was now a golden ring behind the silhouette. I thought I heard something break. My right foot pounced off the floor, instantly launching me over 10 meters forward. Drawn by invisible strings, I swung my sword of eventide. Buxum noticed my charge. His eyes widened through the slits in Saleh helmet. With a remarkable reaction speed, he lifted his sword and took a defensive position. "Rah!" I bellowed, swinging my sword on a direct line at him. King! It almost sounded like a scream. Buxum's longsword split above the hilt, and so did his left arm behind it, and nearly to the elbow. Momentum carried me straight past Theano and Buxum. As soon as I landed, I spun 180 degrees. It was fast enough that I normally would have tumbled, but it was inertia it no longer existed. The twisted smile was gone from Buxum's face. Now that he had lost his sword and arm, his good arm, he lifted the cube again. But before the word got out of his mouth, I swung again. Like the left arm, his right was severed at the elbow, and has vanished pitifully on the spot. Without its support, the golden cube thudded to the floor. For even an enemy, I had to admire the quickness of which Buxum reacted after losing both arms. He promptly spun around and raced with tremendous speed to the exit. "Oh, no, you don't!" I yelled, but the strength had gone out of my legs, and I felt my knee to the right spot. The icon buff resembled meditation buff, blinked and went away. I managed to get to my feet, but by that point, Buxum was already at the door. He slammed into it, pushing it open, and vanished into the hallway. There was no way I could catch up to him at that speed. A few seconds later, one of the HP bars from Team F on the left side of my view neatly disappeared. Struggling against the stifling weight that seemed to be physical cost a mystery buff, I surveyed the boss chamber. Theano, Asuna, Argo, and Mia, and all the other raid members were all still under the effect of binding spell. Surely it wasn't permanent, but how to undo the paralysis? The answer was obvious, however. I sheathed my sword and scooped up the cube off the ground, then walked towards the black block. There was still 1 pixel of health and HP bar hanging it over the air. I knelt in front of the boss and gazed at the golden cube. In my hands at last, this object had changed the lives of many people. Silent, Theano, Mia, Taro, the gardener, and probably Pythagoras' too. Now it was time for it to be destroyed. I snuck the cube against the hole and blocked and pushed it. Smoothly it slid inside on its own. I waited until the surface was sheer to draw my sword again. Using the pommel rather than the well-worn blade edge, I struck the top of the black cube. That was enough. Cracks spread on the spot, and blue light spilled out from within. At that moment, the irrational cube boss of the 6th floor of Aincrad was out of HP, and it crumbled into pieces, including the golden cube within. Only the steel key escaped that fate. It tumbled lightly on the floor. I plopped down on the seat and my pants as the last message proclaiming the last attack bonus appeared overhead. A moment later, the raid members released from their negative status and uproared promptly rose. Some people collapsed on the ground, others flipped over. Cabao turned on Lind. The boss chamber is now light, as though waking from a nightmare, and full of lively sound. I looked up when I heard footsteps approaching and saw Theano coming over. It wasn't just her. Asuna, Mia, and Argo were all rushing towards me. Enveloped in an irresistible blanket of fatigue, I could do nothing more than lift my right hand and wave at my beloved companions.